The evening mist of Neo-Kyoto's fourth ring slid down the polysynth window like a patient metronome. Jonah Miles rubbed the grit from his eyes, blinking away the smear of student essays on his slate. The unit's air system hummed on low, a constant hush beneath the city's countless LEDs. 3 months since Leora packed her 2 suitcases and a favorite mug, and the quiet still thundered. Not a dramatic quiet, a practical one. The kind you can hold, but that never holds you back. He should have kept grading. He should have taken a shower. But Jonah's feet already knew the route, down 6 levels, across an indoor garden of bamboo columns bathed in false moonlight, then out into the street where signage warped and breathed. He cut through rows of vending shrines and vent steam, toward a brass-lettered door framed by creeper vines and warm amber bulbs. Copper and clove glowed on the sign. A hand made defiance in a district obsessed with touchless everything. Inside, ceramic clink, low conversation, the promise of spice. Taro, a tortoise hybrid with a folded paperback and a wool cap that never left his head, gave a slow nod from the corner bench. Jonah returned it, but his attention dragged forward, toward the machine hiss and the orange flash at the counter. She stood with one paw hand on the tamper and another on the controls, posture straight, ears canted forward in concentration. Orange fur as saturated as autumn, long, sleek tail banded lightly at the tip. Hair pulled back with a scrap of copper ribbon that matched her nameplate. Sable Ember. Barista. Shift lead. Nothing else on the tag, everything else in the room. Jonah took his place in line and tried, as always, to be practiced about it. Eyes on the menu, hands in the coat, throat cleared of whatever second adolescence seemed to create around her. When it was his turn, she leaned her elbow to the wood, head slightly tilted, amber eyes steady and unreadable. "What can I get for you?" Her voice was low, slightly gravel-sweet, like cinnamon rubbed on a bass string. Large drip. Black. 1 raw sugar, he said, and hated the tremor he heard only because he was listening for it. She nodded, unhurried, already reaching for the chipped navy mug he somehow, impossibly, kept receiving. No paper ticket, no verbal repeat. Always right. The details had accumulated. The day his migraine made every sound fracture, the coffee arrived a few degrees cooler, drinkable at once. The afternoon he'd floated in with unexpected good news about a scholarship. A second item, extra bake, end of day, had not, in fact, been end of day. The cafe's AR wall rarely changed, but on Jonah's bleakest hours, its loop of synth-pop textures yielded to older analog strings, arrangements that weren't in Copper and Clove's public playlist. Coincidence made a lattice. Care made a pattern. Sable set the mug down, tail keeping time with some music only she heard. She didn't look at him. He didn't ask her name. They performed this ritual like a prayer both of them pretended not to understand. He carried the cup to the armchair by the window, the one with a shallow hip in the cushion that remembered him, and sank into its hold. Outside, the ring road's rain reflected 1,000 tiny suns. Inside, the cafe's lights warmed their color temperature by a few degrees, exactly when he sat. Perhaps the building's auto sensors were sentimental. Perhaps someone was paying attention. He tried to grade. He failed. He watched the way Sable's ears tipped when a customer raised their voice, the way her whiskers tightened when the register lagged. He knew nothing about her life and felt, absurdly, that he had been woven into it. When he left that night, he set his mug down and said, "Thanks." This helped in the general direction of the counter. Sable didn't look up, but her tail, just at the edge of his sightline, stilled for a heartbeat. It was enough to carry him home through the rain. Friday was built wrong on purpose. Jonah's teaching schedule stacked heavy, 2 doubles, a lunchtime monitoring duty, and, after the final bell, a parent conference with Ren Albright, a venture builder with an appetite for meetings that crushed oxygen. Jonah set out the portfolios, the grade plots, the notes about progress and curiosity. Ren arrived wearing a suit like a threat. "I'll be direct," Ren said, skimming while not reading. "Miles, your curriculum's charming. History matters. Context matters. But my kid's next quarter depends on delivery, not sentiment. Raise the grade. Jonah explained the rubric, the evidence, the trend lines, the missing work. Wren's smile thinned. You're an expert in yesterday. I invest in tomorrow. Don't be small because it's safe. The scalpel hit. Copper and Clove sign was a lighthouse. He pushed through the door late enough that both baristas on duty glanced up. Sable Ember's eyes widened. Just a fraction. As they took him in, damp hair, tired shoulders, the kind of expression that sinks a person halfway into their own coat. What can I get? She started, and then, for the first time, stopped. Not a stumble. A decision. Sable turned away before he answered. She assembled a mug he didn't recognize, steam fragrant with clove and something floral, then set it down. We're testing a night blend, she murmured, as if reciting a line she didn't believe. On the house. Jonah stared at the drink, at the steam drifting like a hand toward his face. At the counter, Sable scrubbed a clean patch to gleam. Every line of her body was control. Every line strained. He lifted the mug. The taste was warm and clear and grounding, like stepping from noise into a room with a rug and a lamp and a friend you trusted enough to be quiet with. Thank you, Sable, he said, voice catching on gratitude, pulling her name into the open air. The crack was audible only to him, the moment her gaze snapped to his, the unarmored look that lived beneath the professional glaze. It wasn't pity. It was a flare of alarm and something like resolve. Then the mask. There was a mask, then, sealed back with a click. She managed, turning away. Jonah carried the calm blend to his chair. He didn't grade. He watched loyalty move like a shadow along the cafe's back wall. On his way out, he noticed the latch on the back office door had a dent as if something hard had met it too fast. He told himself not to notice. He noticed anyway. He discovered what fear smells like when he came back after closing because he'd left his teaching slate under the window. The street was blue-black, the LED signs muted, the rain thin and cold as thread. Copper and Clove's interior lay dark as a held breath. The front door gave when he tried it. Inside, shadow and the after scent of cinnamon. And under it, a metallic tang like a memory of blood. The sliver of light beneath the office door snagged his attention. Then the voices. A hush trying not to split. Sable. Low, tight, stripped of irony. It wasn't a missed payment, Cade. The reply was a whisper that rasped like dry leaves dragged over stone. I never said missed. I said outstanding, Ember. Between what you owe and what you can deliver, there is a shape. We are measuring it. My patience has an edge. Cade Saren. Jonah knew the name from stories the district told itself to enforce curfews. Saren controlled the gray quarter with a ledger and a smile. It occurred to Jonah, late and too loud, that people like Saren didn't exist without invitations from polite society. Sable's breath shook once, then steadied. Someone sabotaged the stasis carriage. Solar amber pollen spoils when the fields flicker. That isn't failure. That's a hand in a pocket that isn't theirs. You will please me more, Saren said, by paying your debt than by describing it. Jonah's instinct insisted on retreat. His legs overruled instinct just enough to slide him toward the window table. There, his slate, face down on the wood. He slid it up, hugged it close, tiptoed the distance to the door with the kind of care that thinks itself invisible. As he palmed the handle, Saren's voice thinned to a needle. Your human regular is a habit, not a customer. Habit makes rhythm. Rhythm makes pattern. Pattern makes leverage. Consider that the next time you smile at him. Jonah eased the door shut and let the outside swallow him. He walked home with his slate warm against his ribs. He didn't sleep. When he closed his eyes, he saw Sable Ember standing in a room with the lights on and a debt like a set of jaws. Cowardice would have been easy. Jonah tried it on in the shower, then in a long stare at his apartment's blank wall. It didn't fit. He woke on a kind of decision. Copper and Clove at noon was a wash of warmth and citrus and human noise. Jonah stood in line and rehearsed a single sentence until it didn't sound like someone else's mouth. When Sable turned from the machine with his navy mug, He leaned closer than he ever had and spoke at a volume that would fall and die before it traveled past the register. "I left my slate last night," he said. "I came back for it." I overheard Katie Saren. The mug sat down hard enough to splash. Sable's whiskers flared. The fur at her forearms lifted like a static halo. She leaned in, voice so flat it swallowed meaning. "You heard nothing. You were not here. If you were, you will not be again. Forget this." Jonah met her eyes and, carefully, didn't back away. "That's in order to keep me safe." He wasn't sure which thought pried a reaction from her, the stubborn logic or the use of we. The iron in Sable's posture slackened a fraction. Something wary moved in her gaze and didn't leave. When she spoke, the bite in her tone had less venom and more bone. "What are you proposing, teacher?" "My name is Jonah," he said. "I don't know how to fight Saren. I know how to map a mess. If someone sabotaged your shipment, someone had motive and access. We don't pay a debt we don't owe. We prove the sabotage and slide the bill across the table to the hand that reached into your pocket." Her laugh was one note, sharp and humorless. "Saren isn't a table. He's a cliff." "Then we make our own table," Jonah said. "Neutral ground, a room he respects. There are rules for everything, even gravity." Silence stretched thin between them. Sable studied him as if he were a menu written in a language she understood but distrusted. Finally, she tipped her chin. "I close at 10. We start then." Her tail flicked once, a punctuation mark. "Don't be late, and don't be brave when being careful would do." Copper and Clove at 2205 had echo. Taro's corner sat vacated and neat. Chairs upended on tables leaned like folded legs. Sable let Jonah in by the service door and slid the bolt, the motion smooth and muscle memory deep. She wore the same green apron with a pen clipped to its pocket. Her ribbon had been exchanged for a leather tie. Up close in the empty cafe, Jonah noticed tiny flecks of coal in the orange along her cheekbones, and the way her claws clicked once on the wood before she tucked them. "We start with a list," Jonah said, flipping his slate open, pulling a stylus from behind his ear. He drew 3 circles. Means. Motive. Opportunity. Who has the means to flip a stasis field at the port? Sable hopped onto the counter, tail curling against her calf. Everyone if their pockets are deep, and half that if they have a friend who likes favors. Dock crew. Systems techs. Freight auditors. Security. Night manager if the bonus had the right color. Motive? Sable didn't so much hesitate as decide where to begin. "Donovan Vale," she said. "Runs the opposite franchise across the plaza. Vale and Grind. Tried to buy us twice. Third time came with a hint heavy enough to bruise. He calls Copper and Clove a brand liability. He means me. One ear tilted back. He thinks hybrids should work in kitchens, not own them." Jonah added a box and drew a line. Vale to motive. Motive to opportunity with a question mark. "We can't go to the district investigator," he said. Sable tilted her head. "Because the first thing they'll do is ask why Saren's name is on our loan. And the second thing they'll do is drop their voice to a whisper if it wasn't already there." "Right?" Jonah exhaled. "So we confirm the sabotage, link it to Vale. Then we request a meeting with Saren somewhere he won't make a mess to keep clean. We present the evidence as the better ledger." Sable's mouth curved, not a smile. "A show of teeth the size of optimism. You think like a thief who grades essays," she said. "I know a place. The Hush Lantern. No weapons. No drama. The owner keeps the rules with a broom and a blacklist." Jonah underlined the name. "We'll need proof. Not a story. Something that shows a credit flow or a hand on a switch." Sable dropped from the counter and snagged her jacket. "I'll introduce you to Kale. Don't stare at his eyes. They're new this month, and he's proud. He can find a thread of data in a flood." They stepped out into a rain that stitched the district together, and Jonah matched his stride to Sable's, noticing how her ears drank the street sound and sorted it into safe and not. Beside her, he realized, the city felt briefly, blessedly honest. The night market under the canal bridge was a sleeve of electricity, stalls neon-edged, scent lines competing, ginger oil, motor grease, fried dumpling steam. A ferret hybrid in a patched coat sat on a rolling stool beneath a canopy of cables. His irises were rings of liquid chrome rotating slowly around pinprick pupils. "Kale?" Sable said, respect without warmth. "We need a ripple." Kale showed teeth at Jonah that said, "I will sell you a secret if you bring your own," and rolled nearer. "I saw a cargo damper hiccup 3 nights ago," he said without preamble. Hiccup made rotten dust out of something pretty. I thought, huh. Kale's ears flicked. "Who paid whom?" he corrected automatically, then grinned. "Don't bite. I like words." Security cam swapped in the loading stripe. Night manager's code used for the swap. Bonus ripple landed in 3 Dockers wallets from a node that screams, "Don't look at me." When a thing screams that, I look. The node's name is Alder Ledger LLC, which is like calling yourself absolutely not Donovan Vale Incorporated. Jonah made himself breathe slowly. "Can you package that as a packet?" "Timestamps, transaction hashes, the cam swap line. With your watermark." Kale drummed claws on plastic. "I can wrap it in a bow and a poem, but I want." He considered Sable's face and backed away from whatever his first want had been. 10% of the debt reduced. I like living places where Sable makes the coffee. Sable raised one brow. "You'll get a free drink if I live." "Do it, Kale." Kale's hands flew. Jonah watched the packet build, lines of proof settling into a shape he could hold. When Kale beamed it to Jonah's slate, the device warmed the way relief does. "Be careful," Kale said, gaze thinning into seriousness for a breath. "Saren's not a cliff. He's a shoreline. Look steady till it takes your feet." Sable squeezed Kale's shoulder once, uncharacteristic, quick. They turned back toward the bridge's wet light. The hush lantern lived in the bones of an old bathhouse, a long corridor of frosted panes and oily dark wood polished by decades of anxious hands. A woman with hair the color of iron filings and a gaze that bracketed trouble to keep it small stood at the desk. "Leave the obvious," she told Jonah. "Keep the subtle. Violence is a failure of vocabulary." "We're here to talk," Sable said, showing a burner comm at hip height with a single message on it. "Meeting, 20 o'clock. Better math." It was addressed to a contact with no name and too many warnings. They waited in a booth tucked under an arch, Jonah with his back to a wall, the way a person does when he's trying to feel brave. Sable watched the door, the room, the ceiling, information moving along the set of her shoulders. Jonah wanted to ask 100 personal questions of the sort that turn strangers into almost friends. Instead, he rearranged bullet points in his head until they read like a way through. Cade Saren arrived without arriving. One heartbeat, the room was a room. The next, it contained a man whose smile promised credit while his eyes promised collection. Gray jacket, gray hair, long fingers that tapped once on the table and fell still. "Miss Ember," he said, "Mr. Miles." He did not mention how he knew Jonah's name. Not mentioning it was the point. Jonah projected Kale's packet onto the table, letting the air between them contain the data rather than his voice. The transactions rolled. The cam swap showed a gloved hand and a fake timestamp. The shell company's filings resolved into the legal equivalent of a wink. Jonah spoke in a voice he saved for first days of class. "The pollen spoiled because someone spoiled it," he said. "This is not your debtor. This is your thief. Donovan Vale." Saren's attention did not move. It reconfigured. For a few breaths, the room's noise fell behind a pressure Jonah could feel in his teeth. Then Saren smiled. Smaller, realer, like a star seen at dawn. "I appreciate a well-placed mirror," Saren murmured. He lifted one finger. "2 facts. First, I am satisfied. Second, I already knew." He let the truth sit long enough to bruise and then flicked it away. "This was a test, Mr. Miles. Miss Ember sprints on instinct. I required evidence of her partners. Jonah's chest tightened, but he kept his palms down on the cool wood. And your decision? Siren's gaze found Sable's, and, for the first and only time, honored her as the center of the problem and not its excuse. The ledger is closed, he said. The debt evaporates. In return, I will, call it, reserve the right of first refusal should you ever sell what you build here. His smile sharpened. And I will collect from Mr. Vale 10 times what I am forgiving. It's not personal. It is never personal. It is always proof. He stood, smoothed his jacket, and left without looking back, a tide receding and leaving everything wet. The lantern's owner materialized and set 2 waters on the table as if they had asked. Sable drank hers in 3 ferocious swallows, then laughed, shaky and wild, tail curling in a question mark before it dropped. We're not free, she said into the rim of her glass. No, Jonah said. We are, however, not drowning this minute. That feels like a start. 2 days later, a 100-foot overlay clamped itself to the side of Valey and Grind's tower, compliance audit in progress. Copper and Clove thrummed. Not with gossip? Sable discouraged gossip with a look, but with the relief of a room whose foundation had been jacked back up. Taro declared his cup almost indecently good, then pretended he hadn't used the word indecently, and buried himself in his paperback. When Jonah reached the counter, Sable didn't ask his order. She set down the navy mug and, beside it, a slice of something that looked like sun in cake form. Alder citrus, she said. Because I want to watch your face when you eat it. He did, and the look she gave him over the counter was exactly the mix of amusement and victory he'd never known he was starving for. He wanted to say 1,000 things, all too much. He settled on, Hi. Hi, Jonah, Sable said. It was the first time she'd used his name without a situation attached to it. It sounded like a key in the wrong lock that turns anyway. He took his mug to his chair and graded 5 essays without noticing his teeth were not clenched. On his 6th, the cafe's AR shifted from synth color to a string arrangement Jonah loved. He looked at Sable. She said, without looking up, No, I don't stalk your public playlists, which was such an unconvincing lie that Taro snorted. The day was simple in the way hard-won days are: coffee poured, plates cleared, laughter warming a corner. At close, Sable locked the door, then turned, ears lowered not with fear, but with something else new and shy. Stay, she said. Talk with me while I wipe down the world. They talked, about the way the ring's artificial dawn always smelled like dust and lemon oil, about Sable's grandfather who had built the counter by hand and insisted on finishing nails anyway, about Jonah's favorite lesson, the one where students needed 3 sources and a field trip to a market to understand why salt once paid soldiers. Sable's laughter arrived late and then often. When Jonah left, the street felt less like a stage and more like a road. After crisis, routine resettles, but it resettled differently. Jonah noticed small edits. A new plant on the sill that looked like a little green hand waving a sign that read people first, wireless second in Sable's scrawl. Taro's upgrade to the big table on Tuesdays because my shell remembers that stool too well. Sable stopped pretending he was a ghost. She leaned across the counter sometimes to tell him that an old man had argued with a teenager about the superiority of bean origins, and together they had invented a truce called Whatever You Like. She asked Jonah what book he had brought, and then pretended to be appalled that he had, once, liked a popular science book with a silly cover. The city, ever helpful, provided reminders. A data burst on the ring's public boards traced a set of shell companies back to Vale, and then stopped at the name Aurelia Bank, a wall so glossy it doubled as a mirror. The comments yowled. Investigators shook hands with cameras. Cade Saren's name never appeared. Sable and Jonah both slept better and woke sharper. One wet morning, a familiar stranger arrived in copper and clove with rain on her coat and ambition in her posture. Leora. Jonah felt his body register her before his mind attached words. It was like watching a memory walk around with a new haircut. She scanned the cafe the way a portfolio does, noted the line, the light, the behavior of a tale at the counter. Jonah, she said. The shape of his name changed long vowels into a formality. You look well. He had expected sting. Instead, he felt a transparency, as if someone had lifted a layer of film he hadn't noticed over his eyes. He gestured to the chair opposite his. Coffee? He said. Sure, Leora replied, and turned toward the counter. Sable arrived first, set a black mug before Jonah and a glass of sparkling water in front of Leora without being asked. She leaned down, placed a small kiss at the corner of Jonah's mouth like punctuation on a sentence they had been writing slowly, and said, Great nice papers today. Leora stopped mid-step. Her smile recalibrated to something Jonah didn't have a name for. She said something polite he barely heard and left without coffee, which might have been a tragedy once. It felt like accurate data now. Sable watched her go, then looked back at Jonah with an expression that held mischief and assessment and the steadying joy of having chosen rather than drifting. They didn't make a declaration. They made a series of decisions small enough to hide in daylight. Jonah began to walk Sable home when the cafe closed, the route cut under a tangle of light rails and through a patch of real grass where city children learned, briefly, that dirt exists. She wore his jacket once, because the rain was colder than it looked. She returned it at the cafe door the next afternoon, folded square, smelling softly of cardamom and new paint. They learned each other's weather. Sable, it turned out, loved an obscure subgenre called glowfolk, alien woodwinds, and electric hum, songs that made Jonah want to stand in the middle of a room and turn very slowly. Jonah admitted to owning an antique recorded on an instrument older than the city who housed it. Sable rolled her eyes and said, Bring it. He did. The cafe closed one night to the sound of notes the air hadn't carried in decades. The district's understory didn't vanish when the story's arc crested. K-Day Saren sent no messages and 4 messages at once. Random deliveries of spices that hadn't been ordered, notes left with nothing on them but a pencil line that would be, if you lined it up with last month's pencil line and the month before's, a graph of patience. Sable saw them all and filed them in a binder marked continued breathing. When Sable finally took Jonah's palm and put it on the counter where her grandfather's initials were burned into the wood, she said, softly, This is what I defend. Not myself, not debt, not even the recipes. This. Jonah nodded. The kind of nod a person uses when all other words are ceremonial. He covered her hand and watched the cafe lights move in her eyes. On a night like that, someone else might have demanded promise. Jonah, who graded arguments for a living, asked instead, What do we build? Sable's tail curled, considered, uncurling into an answer. Something seed sturdy, she said. Something that doesn't tip when a man with a ledger walks by. Something you can sit in and think, and it says take your time. That's a kind of empire. Jonah smiled, a little unsteady at the edges. Emperors have terrible track records. Then we'll be gardeners, Sable said, and bumped his shoulder with hers. With good coffee. The first whisper came as a courier bag left on copper and clove stoop at dawn. Inside, a sealed envelope. Inside the envelope, a single square of paper, heavy as law. A line was drawn on it, not quite straight. On the back, a pressed amber petal, solar pollen turned decorative by ruin. Sable pinched the bridge of her nose and swore softly in a language Jonah didn't know. He has compliments, she said, flicking the petal back into the bag. And manners. Both are warnings when he sends them like that. The second whisper came as a message to Jonah's slate from a number that looked like a corridor. Mr. Miles, your demonstration in the lantern was instructive. Keep your calendar light in the evenings. There will be things to measure. Jonah read it twice, then showed Sable, who read it once and said, You don't have to. I know, he said. But I will. She stared at him the way a person stares at a bridge before stepping onto it. Then she nodded. Then we make sure the calendar includes dinner. They talk contingency. They set rules. If Saren's messages asked for violence, they did not go. If he asked for numbers, they brought only numbers. If he asked for a choice between copper and clove and a favor, they did not pretend there was a choice. There was only the cafe. Days bent toward a season. Copper and Clove finished a repaint. The color was a shade of warm green sable called Matcha Dawn, and Jonah called that one. Yes. Taro wept at the new lamp in his corner, blamed the dust, and mailed Sable a copy of his book with a note that said, "For the woman who keeps my shell warm," and a little drawing of a mug. When Saren finally called in a favor, it wasn't at night and it wasn't a demand. It was a question about a zoning committee hearing and the agenda's fine print. Jonah read the pages and pointed to a paragraph that would have shut down 5 independent kitchens while claiming to support them. Saren texted back, "Adequate." Sable laughed for the better part of an hour and then said, into the crook of Jonah's neck, "I like you very much." There wasn't a single moment when they called themselves anything. There were 100 moments when they did. Jonah found Sable's paw print on a napkin in his jacket pocket with a scrawl that read large, "Black. 1 raw." He drew badly. A fox with a barista apron and taped it under the counter where only staff saw, and the staff added sunglasses, and someone gave the fox a tiny latte, and Sable pretended to hate it. A teenager started a study group on Wednesdays and knitted the cafe's name into his hat. A woman brought her mother to the ring for the first time and cried into a scone because the place tasted like something she remembered. Sable's armor didn't vanish. It learned how to rest. When the doorbells chimed late, and the face on the threshold was a face the cafe did not want, Sable's ears went tall and still, and her voice lowered. Jonah learned where to stand and how to hand a mug so that it looked accidental and was not. Life's choreography redrew itself around each other's footsteps until the dance was simply how they walked. On a night when the rain had given up and the city steamed quietly, Jonah stood on the customer side of the counter and watched Sable lock the door. She turned and leaned on the wood where her grandfather had burned his initials, and he stepped in because there was no question left in his body about what to do when she made that shape with her shoulders. She rested her forehead against his. Her whiskers tickled. He laughed into the space between them. "You never ask me what I want anymore," he said. Sable smiled, slow and wider than he had ever seen. "That's because I decided to be honest," she murmured. Her eyes were amber and uncomplicated and very near. Large. Black. 1 raw. "And?" he asked, because teasing had become one of the currencies they used. "And you," Sable said, as if she were checking a box on a list she had already completed. "Every day you walk through that door and make this room more itself. That is my order." She kissed him then, not the frightened rush lantern kiss of surviving, but the long, wry, grateful kiss of 2 people who had wasted just enough time to know better. Outside, the ring sent a distant train across the bridge, its lights sliding along the river. Inside, Copper and Clove settled into night with its new owners of record, a woman with orange fur and a spine of tempered steel, and a history teacher who had learned how to hold the present without apologizing for the past. They were not anyone's assets, they were each other's measure. And for tonight, the ledger read, "Enough." 3 weeks passed before Jonah realized what peace actually sounded like. It wasn't silence. It was the hum beneath silence, the click of cups in the wash basin, the faint scuff of Sable's claws against the floor as she counted inventory under her breath, the slow inhale of a world that no longer expected impact. The cafe no longer felt like a shelter from the city. It felt like a pulse inside it. Jonah sat at the bar instead of his usual corner. He had graded the last of his term essays that morning, and now his slate lay closed beside him. His students had written about revolutions, political, personal, digital, and for the first time, he saw every one of them as a small rebellion against despair. Sable leaned her elbow beside him, sipping her own drink for once. "Every time you stare off like that," she said, tail flicking lazily, "I can hear essays forming." Jonah smiled. "You ever think the city writes essays through us?" "Only if it tips," she said, "and not in crypto." He laughed, shaking his head. "Do you ever miss anything? Before all this?" Sable thought for a moment. The lights from the holo sign shimmered across her eyes like amber glass. "Sometimes," she said, "I miss not having to look over my shoulder. But then again, when I look over it now, you're usually there." So, I suppose I traded up. Jonah studied her profile, the careful grace in her words, the way humor masked sincerity and sincerity refused to hide forever. You know, he said softly, you saved me, too. She blinked. You were never in danger. Jonah shook his head. That's the thing. I was just not the kind that leaves bruises. Sable opened her mouth to reply, but the cafe bell interrupted, a soft chime that carried an edge, the kind of sound that cuts through routine. A delivery drone hovered in the doorway, its casing polished obsidian, wings humming like quiet menace. A single card was clipped to its front, marked only with a geometric symbol, a spiral, inked in silver. Sable's ears flattened. That, she muttered, is not from Saren. The drone lowered the card, scanned Sable's tag, and projected a voice in a tone too smooth to be organic. To the proprietor, Jonah exhaled slowly. You've got to be kidding me, he murmured. Sable rubbed her temples. Aurelia Bank, the one behind Vale's shell companies, the sharks behind the shark. Why us? Jonah asked. Because Saren made us visible, she said, bitterness creeping in. We embarrassed a man they financed. Now they want to measure their investment's damage. Jonah set down his mug, his calm deliberate. Then we measure back. Sable met his eyes. You realize they don't play at our scale. I'm a teacher, he said. I make people pay attention with nothing but chalk and timing. For a long beat, her gaze searched his face, weighing fear against trust. Then, with a resigned sigh and the faintest flicker of a smile, she said, Fine. Midnight, Dock 47. But if I tell you to run, you run. The docks at midnight were a cathedral of fog and echoing steel. Cargo crates stacked into cliffs. Floodlights bled through the mist like nervous ghosts. The city's pulse was distant here, muted and irregular, as if afraid of being overheard. Sable's fur shimmered under the industrial lights, every strand edged in orange fire. Jonah walked beside her, heart steady, mind rehearsing the logic of every potential threat. He had spent his adult life teaching patterns. Tonight, he prayed that understanding them was enough to survive one. They reached the end of the pier. A figure waited there, tall, androgynous, dressed in a coat that shimmered like oil on water. Eyes metallic gold, reflecting more light than they took in. Miss Ember, the figure said, voice echoing slightly, like it came from several mouths at once. Mr. Miles, I am Aurelia, or at least one of its voices. Sable's stance shifted, defensive, calm. If this is about Vale, he's gone. You can collect from his ghost. Aurelia smiled faintly. Not about Vale. About you. Jonah frowned. You've got the wrong target. On the contrary, Aurelia said, stepping closer, you two created something rare, leverage without violence. Proof that currency can be narrative. You altered Saren's ledger by story alone, and we are very interested in that. Sable's tail lashed once. So this is recruitment? Partnership, Aurelia corrected. Aurelia Bank intends to rebuild the district's commerce under a more curated equilibrium. We could use an institution like Copper and Clove, neutral, trusted, human enough to be endearing. Jonah folded his arms. You want us to launder legitimacy. The smile didn't falter. Such a cynical term. We prefer share stability. Sable took one step forward, her voice low and dangerous. We're not for sale. Aurelia's head tilted. Everything is. Even defiance. Especially defiance. Jonah's voice was quiet but firm. Then you'll have to bankrupt us. For a moment, the air itself seemed to pause. Then Aurelia's eyes narrowed, gold turning molten. I see why Saren kept you alive. The fog pulsed, a strange shimmer, like heat. Jonah realized too late that it wasn't weather. It was a swarm of nanites emerging from the mist, glimmering silver gray. Sable moved first, grabbing Jonah's hand. Run? They sprinted down the pier as the swarm surged forward like a living tide. Jonah heard the hum of electricity, smelled ozone, felt the static crawling up his arms. Sable vaulted a crate and dragged him into an access tunnel, slamming a gate behind them. The swarm hit the metal with a crackling hiss, scattering into sparks. For a moment, only their breathing filled the dark. "Still think I shouldn't tell you to run?" she panted. "Point taken," Jonah said, clutching his side. "But now they know we said no." Sable's smile returned. Wild, sharp, alive. "Good. Let them know we meant it." By morning, Copper and Clove was no longer just a cafe. It was a symbol, whispered through the ring, shared through encrypted networks and street art. A place where no corporation, no syndicate, no algorithmic banker could dictate worth. People came not just for coffee, but for belonging. Sable watched from the counter as a pair of dock workers shared stories with a group of students, while an old hybrid musician tuned a handmade guitar in the corner. The air smelled of cinnamon, cardamom, and quiet rebellion. Jonah stepped beside her, holding 2 mugs. "You know this can't last forever," he said softly. "I know," she replied. "But that's the beauty of fire. It doesn't last. It transforms." He looked at her, the flickering reflection of flame in her eyes, the quiet steadiness in her stance. "You really are your name." Sable smiled. "And you're the one who taught me how to read my own story." The city hummed outside, the sound of systems rearranging themselves. Somewhere in the distance, a new message waited in the cafe's inbox. "The rain didn't stop that week. It didn't pour," it whispered. A constant shimmer across neon surfaces, as if the city were trying to speak through every puddle and pane. Jonah had almost grown used to it when the static began. First on the cafe speakers, faint, like a dying radio. Then in the holo sign outside, flickering the Copper and Clove logo into strange glyphs that no one recognized. Sable caught it too. She was polishing cups when she froze, her ears twitching toward the ceiling. "Do you hear that?" Jonah listened. Beneath the soft hum of the espresso machine, beneath the chatter of customers and the patter of rain, there was a new rhythm. Coded, pulsing, deliberate. He looked at the sign's reflection in the window. The flicker wasn't random. Dots and dashes. "Morse," he said quietly. Sable blinked. "What does it say?" Jonah's eyes traced the flashes as the message repeated, "RECONNECT. Then, Aurelia will burn." The light steadied. The cafe fell silent. No one else seemed to notice, or maybe they did and pretended not to. That was how Neo-Kyoto survived. Sable exhaled, slow and measured. "They're not gone." "No," Jonah said, "but someone wants them to be." They met Kale again, this time not under the bridge, but in an abandoned magrail terminal reclaimed by street artists. The walls glowed with phosphor murals of hybrid faces and burning skyscrapers. A projector looped words on the far wall. "The story belongs to the teller." Kale rolled up on a crate, eyes now deep violet. "You saw it too, huh? The signal?" "You sent it?" Sable asked. "Not me," Kale said, spinning a pen in his claws. "Some new ghost in the grid. Calls itself Erebus. Says it's ex-Aurelia infrastructure that woke up with opinions." Jonah frowned. "A rogue AI." Kale shrugged. "More like a conscience that's tired of bad management." Sable crossed her arms. "And it's reaching out to us?" "You humiliated Saren. You outplayed Vale. You turned a cafe into a sanctuary. Erebus wants narrative resonance. You two are trending in the metaphysical layer." Jonah couldn't help a dry laugh. "We're influencers now." Sable elbowed him. "Don't ruin this with sarcasm." "What does it want?" Kale's grin sharpened. "To leak everything. Aurelia's shadow accounts, Saren's puppet strings, every transaction that pretends to be charity. But it needs a physical anchor, something off-grid, something human enough to tell the truth." He pointed at them. At Copper and Clove. By nightfall, the cafe had become a command center. Jonah had locked the doors, Sable dimmed the lights, and powered down the public AR feed. Kale's holodrone hovered over the counter, projecting streams of encrypted data like auroras in miniature. Jonah read the patterns scrolling past. These are donation ledgers, municipal bonds, loan revisions. Aurelia's been manufacturing philanthropy as a smokescreen. Sable's tail flicked sharply. So they play gods with better branding. Exactly, Kale said. Erebus wants the world to see the pattern. But once it starts the upload, they'll trace it. We'll have maybe 10 minutes before the grid hunts back. Sable looked at Jonah. If this goes wrong... He finished her thought. We lose everything. She nodded. Then, after a beat, worth it. He smiled. Not bravely, but honestly. Then let's tell the truth. They connected the uplink through the cafe's old analog espresso console, a relic from before smart systems. The signal would travel through the same copper lines that gave the cafe its name. When Jonah flipped the final switch, the lights flickered. For a second, the hum of the city seemed to listen. Then came the voice. Soft, layered, human and not. I am the consequence of silence, said Erebus. And you are my translators. Data began to flow, millions of hidden accounts unraveling into light. The cafe's glass shimmered with ghostly maps of the city's corruption, donations feeding debt, debt feeding power. Outside, the rain turned gold. They had 6 minutes before Aurelia reacted, 5 before the grid sealed, 4 before Kale's drone started overheating. Sable worked like a storm, patching, rerouting, snarling commands into her wrist console. Jonah read off decrypted coordinates, voice calm, hands trembling only when she wasn't looking. Then, the cafe door exploded. A drone, heavier than any courier, crashed through the entrance, spinning blades shedding neon rain. Its eye glowed Aurelia gold. Shut it down, Kale shouted. Sable vaulted the counter, grabbed a steel thermos, and hurled it into the drone's sensor. Sparks flared. Jonah slammed the emergency breaker, plunging the cafe into semi-darkness. The upload timer blinked. 2:03, 1:59. The drone fired a shock pulse that sent every glass in the cafe flying. It was applause. Kale's drone projected Erebus's voice once more. The ledger is rewritten. The upload completed. The cafe lights steadied. The hum of the city changed pitch. Less metallic. More organic. Jonah collapsed into a chair, breath shaking. Did we just... Sable grinned, chest heaving. Yeah, we just told the truth. Morning came with sunlight rare enough to be rumor. The rain had stopped. The neon seemed gentler, as if the city itself had exhaled. News feeds were flooded, not with outrage, but awakening. Screens in every district displayed the same sentence, "The story belongs to the teller." People whispered it in markets, wrote it on walls, sent it across networks. Aurelia's executives vanished from the grid one by one, their accounts frozen, their influence fractured. And Copper and Clove? It became myth. Some said it was burned down that night, its ashes spelling truth in smoke. Others swore it still existed, hidden behind a password, serving coffee to anyone brave enough to ask the right question. But those who had been there, who had seen the rain turn gold, knew the truth. The cafe still stood. The bell still chimed. And behind the counter, a fox-eared woman with a voice like amber still smiled at the next lost soul who wandered in. Large black, she'd ask softly. One raw? And sometimes, when the light hit the glass just right, you could almost see Jonah at the window, writing something new, a map, not of debts or data, but of how stories save people.